over as opinion page editor on Monday.
Okay.
I'm Shelby Flagg. I'm a reporter.
Brianne Fonensteel, Chief Politics Reporter.
Rachel Stassenberger, Politics Editor.
Okay, we're just going to jump right in with questions since this is
Okay.
your second time before the board. One of your main campaign themes is that you can get things done, that you have a record in the Senate of bipartisanship, and Shelby here has reported about the Lugar Bipartisan Index, and
Yeah.
you do much better than most on that. But the partisan divide seems deeper than ever. You could be, of course, dealing with a Republican Senate. We'd like to just hear more from you about how exactly will you get things done, overcome the opposition and gridlock.
I think anyone running for president has to have as their main goal getting things done, because you can give all the lofty speeches you want and put all the plans out there, but if you actually can't deliver, then you haven't improved people's lives, which I think should be the cornerstone for any candidate. And for me, I have, first of all, as you noted, my track record where I've actually done that. And it is on everything from farm bankruptcy, which is a bill that just got signed into law this year, a bill that I led with Senator Grassley, as well as other bills that we have done together. I think something like over 20 of them in the last Congress now. I updated your numbers. I did with him, but as well as nearly every other senator. And I've always believed that you have to find common ground where you can, and you stand your ground when you should. And when I look at the challenges facing our country, first of all, economic, you have to see these main challenges in front of us. And the first being doing something about health care. We've had a number of Republicans vote for things like bringing in less expensive drugs from other countries. It is the number one issue for health care that people care about. And then there's other things like Medicare negotiation that hasn't been as bipartisan. So you kind of figure out which ones you stand your ground on that you don't have support yet, and which ones can you do more easily. Immigration reform. We passed that in the U.S. Senate, so I know where those votes are, and that's why I believe firmly I can get it done in the first year. Climate change. That one, we are really going to have to push that, and as president, I'm going to just say we are getting this done. There's certain things you have to pick out that you may not have as much Republican support on, and push this as your ultimate goal and make it clear. And it's part of the reason that I've put out the 100-day plan. One, I think it's really important to bring back Americans' trust in their government. But two, there are 137 and counting things that a new president can do without Congress. And it's not like I don't love Congress, but I think it's important to show immediate progress. And they are all legal, I would add, given what President Trump has done in the last few years. But they're legal things that can be done. So I would do a combination of reaching across the aisle and getting some of the big ticket items done bipartisan. Some of the ones, I think, like climate change, you just have to put your presidency on them, because right now you don't have the votes on the Republican side and you have to make the case to their constituents. And then there's a number of things in that area that you can do without Congress, like the clean power rules, gas mileage standards, getting into the International Climate Change Agreement. And then the second grouping of things would be along the lines of all those things you can do without Congress. So that's how I do it.
Let's drill down a little. You mentioned immigration reform. Now that's one where, at least on some aspects, like the Dreamers, people brought here as children, that all the polls say there's pretty widespread agreement on, yet nothing has happened for years. So what could you do that no president has done yet to show some movement on that?
Sure. So I was part of both immigration negotiations. The first one, because Senator Kennedy asked me to be part of the group. It was with Lindsey Graham, John Kyle. It was when President Bush was president. And President Bush dearly wanted to get this done. But unfortunately, he waited till the end of his term, and he didn't have the political clout at that moment to get it done. And it was sad because we had support of a lot of different people across the nation. And it got to by, I remember the Lou Dobbs show and a lot of right-wing talk. So then it sat for a while. The downturn happened. President Obama comes in. He wants to get it done too, but the downturn's happening and he waits. And I think it would have been very difficult to do during the downturn. By the time he gets there to get it done, the House is in Republican hands, and while we pass it in the Senate with bipartisan support, including from Senator Grassley, it fails in the House of Representatives, and it would have otherwise been signed into law. Right now, I believe the House will stay Democratic. I think we have a very good chance of moving the Senate Democratic. But regardless of that, we've seen people like Mike Rounds want to move on immigration reform. And you look at that last bill in 2013, supported by the Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO, supported by the migrant worker groups and the Farm Bureau and the Farmers Union. I can build that coalition to get it done. It is critical to Iowa's economy because we need workers in our fields and in our factories. We need workers significantly in our nursing homes and in our assisted living facilities and our hospitals. It's one of the reasons I lead the Conrad 30 bill, which allows people when they graduate from medical school in the U.S. To be able to stay and do their residency in underserved areas, including rural, instead of having to go back to their home country. And so making this economic argument for immigration reform when people know that their loved ones are being cared for by many immigrants in many of these places, I think is a very strong way to do it, because immigrants don't diminish America, they are America. I also think we should remember that the president is trying to use immigrants as pawns. He's constantly focusing on the issues related to the border, which are important issues. His solutions are wrong, but then he refuses to talk about all the immigrants here who are working, who come from all over the world. 10% of the undocumented workers here are from Asia and Asian countries. And so I think it is really important to make a broader economic argument. And the last thing I want to say that kind of goes into your first two questions is that if we're going to get any of this done, we can't just win, we have to win big. And we have to win with a consensus with moderate Republicans and independents, just like you just saw in Kentucky and in Louisiana and in the Virginia state House and state Senate races. People came together and said, you know what, I don't like this mean-spirited rhetoric of the president. In the first two states I mentioned, he had visited there the night before. I don't like that, and I want a different country. I want to have a president in place that I respect. So to get any of this done, I would project that we win big. And winning big means bringing those people with us. That puts us in a much better place than the gridlock we are right now to move on immigration reform and some of these other issues that I just raised.
You've advocated making sure every citizen is registered to vote when they turn 18. What are some of the impediments to that, and what are you doing to secure bipartisan?
Well, the major impediment to that is there's a bunch of people in the Republican Party that don't want to allow everyone to vote. And that is pretty obvious by the kind of laws that you see in places like North Carolina, where a court said that they discriminated the legislature and the governor with surgical precision. This was a previous governor, with surgical precision. And that was words of one of the judges, was a Republican appointed judge. You saw it with the purges, you saw it with the resignation of the Secretary of State in Texas over the illegal conduct that he was engaged in. So there's a serious problem going on right now. And I think calling people on it, because in the end, election reform and making sure people can vote and limiting some of that influence of big money and dark money should be a bipartisan issue. It always has been. Iowa in the past had, a big history on both the Republican and Democratic side of wanting people to vote. Minnesota has the highest voter turnout in the country, and it was always a bipartisan issue. So you have to go back to that. I was struck by an ad that was run in the 2018 congressional campaign in Minnesota by one of my friends, Angie Craig, who won a very red purple district. And her ad showed people standing, you could see it running in Iowa, on bales of hay trying to talk, and their voices were muted out, with the argument being, that big money and outside interests are muting your very ability to talk, that you don't have a voice. That ad to me, when I saw it, it looked like a libertarian ad. It was not an ad just targeted at Democrats. So I think making that argument, just as kind of what happened with gay marriage, actually, the argument of state by state by state, that this is about people's rights, and getting away from the partisan nature of that and making it a cornerstone of a campaign is the way you do that. And I am the perfect person to do this because I don't come from a rich family. I've always had to run my own campaigns and raise the money on my own. As I pointed out on the debate stage, I set the all-time U.S. Senate record of raising $17,000 from ex-boyfriends. And I am someone that feels this, not just in my head, but in my heart. And I think that there are a lot of really good things we could do to change this. I'm also the ranking on the Rules Committee that has jurisdiction over elections, the ranking Democrat, highest ranking Democrat. And so I'm leading a lot of those bills, not just that one, but to make the social media companies be accountable for their the ads that are being purchased that are political, and for having backup paper ballots. We just saw what happened in Pennsylvania, which was an outrage about election equipment. I got punched by the president in the White House on a bipartisan bill with James Langford, a conservative from Oklahoma. And one of the reasons I want to be president is then I won't be gut punched because I'll be the president.
Talk a little bit about how you would make what are now the voting wars bipartisan. You talked about rights, and you
Right.
said looks like a libertarian ad, but
Yeah.
it certainly is partisan, not only in the Senate and in the
Right.
House, but in states. We've seen the change in Minnesota or in Iowa.
Okay, so the first way you do it is, like I said, you win big. Because if you win big and you bring with you moderate Republicans and independents, and they know this is wrong to shut people out from voting, then you're in a much better place to change it, regardless really the composition, but you're in a better place because you presumably have kept the House, won back the Senate, or at least made it incredibly close. So you're in a better place. The second way you do it is having a Justice Department that's actually going to enforce the voting laws, because when I'm president, I'll put in a good Attorney General and we'll make sure that's happening, and supporting some of the efforts to move forward in court. I would say that's another thing. That's not exactly your bipartisan dream, but it is a way a new president can enforce the laws. The third thing is by putting myself out there and reforming the FEC, which is a nightmare right now. There's not even a quorum. There's no way to enforce things. I was talking to Steve Bullock on the phone the other day, and he was talking about how that made it hard for him as he looked at public financing, because you don't even have a quorum in the FEC. And remember, the president likes this mess. He wants chaos. And so I think a lot of this will be enforcing the rules, putting together a coalition, appealing to some Republicans that want to have everyone at the table, and getting it done. And getting a constitutional amendment passed to overturn Citizens United would be the ultimate goal.
I was just going to ask whether the judiciary is a leg of that stool too, or if
Yeah.
you have any confidence.
Well, they are. I mean, the way you try to reverse some of these is by getting some Supreme Court justices that respect precedent when it comes to voting. You look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent in the Shelby case, which threw out part of the Voting Rights Act. I think that says it all.
You say we've entered a new gilded age, and have pledged not only a tougher review of prospective antitrust of company mergers, but also a retrospective review. Is that fair if companies have come together under current laws to go back and try to unscramble the egg?
I think so. I mean, what you're doing is protecting competition, basically. That's the antitrust laws. And a lot of it started right here in Iowa with the Granger movement, where a ramshackle group of farmers and some workers said enough is enough. We're tired of the rail monopoly, and we want more better rates for rail, and we want better competition. And so that led to, in Iowa, actually the first antitrust law in the country that wasn't just about one commodity being passed. out of your state. And then that eventually led to the Sherman Act, which was led by a Republican senator out of Ohio, taken up in a big way by a Republican president in Teddy Roosevelt. So why do I make this point? This has been a bipartisan issue in the past, and it's coming back to be one again, which I think is great. I just texted Mike Lee this morning, who works on the Antitrust Subcommittee with me, about an issue relating to this. And so I think what we need to do is to revamp the antitrust laws in a few ways. Make sure we have enforcement in place, and Senator Grassley and I have a bill together to up the funding for enforcement, because he gets what a big problem this is. And you do it by charging more for the mega deals. And that helps the FTC and the Justice Department. The second thing you do is change some of the standards to look at the new types of monopolies we're having. Monopsony, which is sort of controlling everything under you. Changing some of the burden for how we review these. And I lead that bill. And then the third thing, of course, is enforcement. And one of the things that I do think we should do is to look back at some of the mergers. Just all you're doing, and this has happened in the past, think about AT&T. Okay, that was mergers that were allowed, right? Mm-hmm. And then what happens is the Justice Department, under both Democratic and Republican presidents, this is leadership from the White House, comes in and says, you know what, this is not good how this is going. We don't have enough competition. We're not developing new products. They go in, they push the envelope in a big way. AT&T breaks up, long distance rates go way down, and innovation is ushered in. That's one of our best recent examples of the enforcement of the antitrust laws. And essentially, that was looking backwards. A simpler way, of course, is you're simply looking back at some of these deals that were made, Facebook and Instagram being a major example of that. One of my, a smaller example, but I love for people that drive and rely on GPS and things like that, and maps, Waze, which is a very interesting ways to get where you're going. A lot of people don't know that Google, that owns Google Maps, bought Waze. So their chief upstart competitor is now owned by the same company. Online travel, 90% of those sites that you go to are owned by the same two companies. They just keep buying them. And so all of that leads to less competition and worse prices. So I look at this as pro-competition. It was Adam Smith who originally said that we should fear the army of monopolies and what this will mean. And our founding fathers anticipated this. They just didn't put it in the Constitution, but they were worried about it. And so I think this is actually an opportunity to work on this. We've seen a 30% reduction in startups in our country, and a lot of it has to do with consolidation. So it is smartly looking at these deals and doing it from a viewpoint of let's make sure we have a thriving entrepreneurship, capitalism, competition, and the way you do that is to make sure there's not illegal consolidation.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the tech sector. You know, Elizabeth Warren says, you know, the Amazons, Googles of the world should be broken up. Do you go that far, or do you say, I have some plans for them?
No, I think that could well happen, but I think you have to do it within a legal framework. You can't just go in there and say, I'm going to break up companies. You do it by looking at the laws and looking at what I just said. You look back at some of these mergers and you figure out if in fact there is a monopoly, and then you go in there and your Justice Department and the FTC makes the changes. So that's one thing I do. The second is tax on data. If they're using it for their own private means, that you tax them for it, and then the money can go back to the consumers who basically sold the data. Third thing, privacy. Just this last week, Maria Cantwell and Brian Schatz and I introduced a bill that is focused on privacy. There's been no developments in privacy with all of this online data. Another one to look at with the holiday season upon us is a bipartisan bill I've got with Lisa Murkowski, which gives individual consumers ownership of their health data on Fitbits and other things. And as president I cannot tell you how much easier it would be to get these things done, because some of these things you can do without Congress, but they have to be priorities, and you have to be willing to stand up to the big interests, which I've done repeatedly with the technology companies. Mark Warner and I were the ones that led with saying that, and John McCain, saying that they had to be accountable for these political ads before anyone was even talking about it. I lead the Honest Ads Act. I led the bill on privacy, the first bipartisan one that got introduced with Senator Kennedy of Louisiana. I am ready to take them on, and they know it, and we simply can't keep going without any privacy laws in place. They are companies like any other company. They like to pretend they're just web hubs. Two of them were the first $1 trillion companies in our country's history.
So on State of the Union last weekend, you were asked whether you would vote to acquit the president, and you said, at this point, I don't see that, but then you quickly followed and said, but I'm also someone that wants to look at every single count.
Correct.
So with a trial in the Senate, how do you approach that? I mean, do you just say, I'm going in with a totally open mind, fresh perspective?
Yeah.
Or do you go in having read a lot, learned a
Yeah.
lot, and have lots already on your mind?
That's an interesting question. I was thinking about how when I was a prosecutor, jurors would have to be sequestered sometimes so they couldn't look at the news at all. That's not what this is. And no one should pretend that it is. This is a hearing, and we have to have fair rules in place. But of course, people have looked at the news and commented about things, because this is a different thing. It's something our founders set up. They decided we should have impeachment provisions in the Constitution because, in the words of James Madison, who I appreciate as a president because he was 5'4", which is a good height for a president. But he's the one that said that a president could betray the trust of the American people for a foreign power. And that's his argument for why we should have those procedures in the Constitution. So right now what's happening is the House is gathering evidence. So in answer to your question, of course, I've watched some of the testimony over in the House. I haven't had blinders on. And I was especially captivated. Well, I know Ambassador Yovanovitch, having been to Ukraine twice. And I love the Fiona Hill story of how when she was taking a test when she was 11, her classmate behind her was set one of her pigtails on fire, and she doused it with her own hand. I love the strength of those women who testified. But what really captivated me was Lieutenant Colonel Vindeman, who said to his dad, you know, this is a country where you can tell the truth. And you can live here, and basically you're not going to get killed for telling the truth. And it reminded me of an Iowan, actually, the former counsel to the Army, Joseph Welch, from Primgar, and I went through the town to try to find his house. And he's the one that looked at Joseph McCarthy, and during the McCarthy hearings, and he said, have you no sense of decency, sir? So to me, this is more than just a legal proceeding. This is a decency check. It's a values check. It is a patriotism check. And it is not just a legal proceeding, because there are so many other examples of where people in this country have been horrified by what this president has done. And it is a part of that story, but it's not the only part. So when I look at this evidence, it'll come over to the Senate. I'll look at each count and I'll make a decision. But I do it with that in my heart, because, you know, I think that this is a much bigger problem than even this impeachment proceeding is about. And that's why I'm running for president. I just think we are bigger than this guy that's in the White House right now.
So, you know, the very language of the Constitution, which was, of course, debated just yesterday, but treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, it seems pretty clear that the founders wanted a pretty high bar so that a president wouldn't always be dragged before Congress on impeachment. Do you think at any time, just considering censorship, a censure would have made more sense than going the full route of impeachment?
Yeah, well, that's going to be for the House, the full Senate to decide. But I think what happened here at its core, and first of all, just to step back, bribery back then meant something different. And in fact, the words from Alexander Hamilton were public trust, that it was about public trust. And when you look at that betrayal to a foreign power and some of those other words, I think you can interpret it in a very different way than what those words mean now. And I always like to point out that to my Republican colleagues that they are the strict constructionists. They are the ones that like to look back at what the founders meant and what the founders said, and that's pretty clear. I think that we look at this, we just look at each count and make a decision, and we'll make a decision about impeachment.
So the notion of executive privilege is nowhere in the Constitution. Do you believe there is such a thing, and how far do you see taking that notion as president?
Well, I think that this president has attempted to take it way too far, and you saw during the Attorney General Barr's hearing that I took part in, the broad view that he had, as well as the Supreme Court nominee in Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Gorsuch. They have these incredibly broad views of executive power that I do not share, and I don't believe are consistent with where we are. I mean, you look at some of the things that Attorney General Barr said in his, I think it was 17 or 19-page job application, where he wrote a memo before the hearing that he sent out, and he would consider a whole bunch of things that I don't think the American people would agree with him on as not subject to any check and balance from Congress. And I think the checks and balance are critical to our democracy. And what we know, just for the specifics, is that in the Nixon tape case that is relevant here, that those had to be turned over. And you just saw the recent decision by the federal judge that ordered that the former counsel to the White House, McGahn, should have to be able to testify in front of Congress. So I think all those are signs of a judiciary that understands that check and balance and limits on executive privilege and executive power. And I would follow the law. But I would also do things like, make my taxes public that I've already done, make sure we pass a law that the president has to make their taxes public. I would be much more transparent about decision making, including about any oil waivers that I think this is a great example, not to bring it back to Iowa, but where this president has just gone amok and taken what used to be a sort of agreed upon limited power and made it so broad that it screwed up the biofuels economy in the state of Iowa. Did you like how I took our executive privilege to that? That was, I will admit, that was a leap.
You make that question in 5 sentences.
Yes, but it's the same thing. It is along the same things, because he's done things that take his powers to an extreme, and then you realize, okay, we never thought something like that could happen because it was supposed to be for limited cases. So then you think, okay, not only as president will I review what he did and reverse a good part of it, but then you think, how can we put in law things that will limit someone from doing that again?
So is there an action or position that you actually agree with the president on?
Okay, I agree with him on some of the things he said at the beginning, but that he hasn't done. I'll start with that he wanted to do something on infrastructure, on election night. He said that in his election night speech, and that he wanted to do something on pharmaceuticals. And he hasn't followed through. I was glad at the time that he said it, but he hasn't followed through. In terms of things that he has gotten done, I would say that the First Step Act that he signed into law, that I was a co-sponsor of, was something that I agree with. And that is the one that reduces the sentences for nonviolent offenders. That is just a beginning. I think you have to move to the Second Step Act, which creates incentives for state and local to reduce some of those sentences as well. And 90% of people incarcerated are in state and local jails. So that would be the second step.
Could you talk a little bit about the president and trade and tariffs? Obviously, here in agricultural state, trade and tariffs have been difficult, but in the Iron Range, there was great cheering
Right.
on further tariffs.
Yeah.
And so how do you divide that pie?
Exactly. So For me, first of all, you step back and say trade is essential to the U.S. economy. We know that over 90% of our customers are outside our borders. I think it's like 95%. That's why you have trade agreements, but you want to make them as fair as possible. And I voted for some trade agreements and voted against others. I look at them individually. But one of the things, no matter where you are on trade, that there's general agreement on is that you have to enforce the trade laws. And the story of the Iron Range of Minnesota is a story of a lack of enforcement that turned into enforcement that made a difference. And that actually started at the tail end of the Obama administration, where a group of us invited the president's chief of staff, I know we talked about this last time, up north, and we made very clear that this was very damaging to the economy, and they upped their trade enforcement and used targeted tools. And you can use tariffs or other things and penalties to basically say it's illegal for China to dump steel, and we got results, and that helped. That continued into the Trump administration. But my problem with what the president has done is that he's basically used a meat cleaver, or we can call it a tweet cleaver, when it comes to trade. And there's an old saying in trade policy, keep your threats and keep your promises. And he hasn't done either. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing such an increased number of farm bankruptcies and all the trouble that we've seen ahead. He didn't have a signing ceremony when he signed Senator Grassley's and my bill on farm bankruptcies, because I don't think he wants anyone to know. But we've seen a 25% increase in farm bankruptcies, and that's why we passed something to make it easier. You think of what's happening in the soybean market. He has conducted himself on world affairs in this chaotic way, including walking out of and not doing the last press conference with the world leaders on NATO. That just happened. It was just a perfect example of this. He gets mad because people are making jokes about him. People make jokes about other leaders all the time. People make jokes about other senators. If you're that thin-skinned and you can't handle it, you shouldn't be president. You just shouldn't be. You've got to be stronger than that. And America just doesn't walk out. And that's what he keeps doing. He backs away from the International Climate Change Agreement. He backed away from the nuclear agreement with Russia. He backed away from the Iranian nuclear agreement, which has caused a lot of chaos in Iran now moving towards busting the caps on enriching uranium. And I am a president that would stand with our allies instead of are dictators, and I would stand with innocents instead of tyrants. And so when I look at what's happened with trade, you cannot divorce it from what his relationships are with the rest of the world. And I just think we should be working with the rest of the world and being a leader again instead of what he has done. And I think it's especially been harmful in a state like Iowa that is more dependent on selling goods to market and selling goods on the international economy.
Could you walk through with us sort of your criteria for committing troops to war?
The first thing is you have to look at America's interest and what this does for our country. And when you have something that is a clear assault on our country's values and our country's interest, then you would look at committing troops. I think it is really important that you go to Congress, and you go to Congress to get authorization before you make that decision. That's why I've been such a big supporter of renewing discussions of the authorization of military force when it comes to decisions that we make regarding the Mideast, and not just relying on the old authorization of military force. Then you've got to consult with your allies so you don't go it alone. And that also has to figure into your thinking about if you are going to do this alone, what are you committing to? There's obviously emergency things that can happen where you make a decision before you go to Congress. That's allowed. But then if you're going to make some long-term commitment, you go to Congress before you make a decision. So I would you've got to look at our interests for our country, whether or not we're alone or with our allies. You have to look at the loss of life and what it will involve, so you make a decision with your eyes wide open. And too many times, I think decisions are made without eyes wide open. You really have to consult your military advisors. You've got to make a decision that is respects their views. You're still the commander-in-chief, but respects their views, and then you go make your decision.
I've read that you've pledged that no troops would be in Afghanistan by the end of your first term. Is that accurate?
Yes.
What about residual troops?
Yes, I think you could have counterintelligence troops there. You could have people that are doing training and other things. I am practical about this. One example is I didn't think we should remove the 150 troops that were on the border with Syria, where the president precipitously withdrew those troops. And so you have to look at each case and make a decision about what works. I mean, we've had residual troops in many areas of the world. I just think when you look at it as a whole, we have been there now. Troops, men and women who are being deployed there, young men and women, weren't even born before we first got involved there.
I wanted to ask a few economy questions.
Okay, good.
We didn't talk last time about your proposal for UP accounts.
Yes, I just talked about that. Yeah.
Personal savings account. Employers would be required to set aside at least 50 cents per hour worked. So how do you overcome that initial opposition of an employer saying, I don't have money to do that?
Yeah, you overcome it with tax credits and helping these companies to pay for it, because you make a commitment. And as you know, we actually have on our website, and I can leave you with a table showing how we pay for every single thing I propose, because I, from the very beginning, when I announced in that blizzard, talked about the fact that I think we have to do something about the debt and have be able to show, especially with the president who's been running our country like one of his bankrupt casinos, that we're going to be prudent about what we do. But this is a really good idea, and it's based on the fact that a third of our workers right now are in the gig economy. They are contractors, they are part-time workers. The nature of work is changing. A lot of young people aren't going to be in the same job, except if they work at the Des Moines Register, their whole life. My dad was at his same newspaper his whole life. Actually, there have been a lot of layoffs in the newspaper industry, which we are aware of. My dad was in his job his whole life. My mom was a teacher in a few different districts, but she had the same job her whole life. The world has changed. 1/3 of those workers. So how do you make sure that they're able to work in this economy and still have stability? So it is not just about retirement, which I'll get to in a minute. It is about doing the child care and work family leave as I've proposed. It is for all workers. It is, which is, by the way, not paid for by the small employers. That's a federal program that would be put in place. It is making sure that there's a good enough minimum wage. And then it is, at the other end of it, making sure that they have some retirement beyond Social Security, which you'd have to keep strong. The UP savings account allow 50 cents an hour to be put in these workers' retirements. It would give them, if they worked in the gig economy their whole life, I mean, maybe at some point they go to a place that has a 401k or a pension, but it would give them $600,000 at the end of their work time. And it would also allow them to take out $2,500 a year if it met the criteria for emergency expenses. Half of Americans right now can't afford the $400 for an emergency expense. And this proposal actually has been supported by moderate groups as well as SEIU. And so it has some broad support, at least within the Democratic Party. And I think that there are a lot of Republicans who are acknowledging this changing work, that people aren't going to have pensions or 401ks at all of their work stops. So this is a whole part of this idea of not just living in the past, it is looking at the future of work and how we're going to make it work for people.
Gun violence, another one we didn't talk about last time. It sounds like most of your positions are fairly kind of generic Democratic positions.
Oh, no.
Universal background checks.
Okay.
Banning bump stocks.
Yeah, but there's something different, but yes, go on.
Well, what distinguishes your position, and then
Okay.
again, how do you move past the gridlock?
The first thing that distinguishes me from other people on that stage is that I'm leading one of the major bills, and that is the bill to close the boyfriend loophole. That is one of 3 bills sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. It's inside the Violence Against Women Act right now, and it basically says domestic abusers shouldn't be able, convicted ones, shouldn't be able to go out and get an AK-47. Half of the domestic homicides now involve a dating relationship as opposed to people who are married. And it is actually one of the highest rates of homicide involves guns in the hands of domestic abusers. We have had some horrible murders in Minnesota in the last 2 weeks involving one couple that was divorced. He shot her, his 2 kids, and himself. We had another one involving a woman who had been abused, whose, I think, partner went and killed her. And this is an area that's been long overlooked and is ripe for change. And so that's one thing that distinguishes me. The second is my career as a prosecutor. So I've been able to see what happens when you enforce the gun laws, which I was commended for doing. But I also realized way back then that it wasn't enough. And that's why I tried to get the assault weapon ban as part of a group of law enforcement people reauthorized back then, and we were unsuccessful. Then it's moved on now. The moms tried after Sandy Hook in a big way, and they were unsuccessful. The change I see right now in our country is those kids in Parkland who've been building on the work of Moms Demand Action and other groups, and they became icons across the country. And then other kids started talking to their dads and grandpas, leading me to the third way I'm distinguished in terms of leading this effort is I come from a Midwestern state, that has a proud tradition of hunting. And so I look at all these proposals and say, do they hurt my Uncle Dick and his deer stand? And they do not. That is a different perspective than anyone else on that stage. And I think it's the key perspective to have as you look at how you're going to advance these bills and actually get them done. Finally, I'm the only one in Congress on that stage that sat across the President of the United States after Parkland because of my leadership on the gun issue. And that's when I saw him, I think it was over 10 times, say that he wanted to see universal background checks done. I still have the piece of paper where I made hash marks every time he said it. He never got it done because he met with the NRA and he folded. I won't fold because I have a long history of leadership on this issue and because I know the secret, and that is the majority of hunters actually want to see some of these bills passed, universal background check. It's not a secret because it's in the public polls. The majority of Trump voters want to see universal background checks passed. All we need is a president that can lead and also understands this culture and how we get this done. It must get done.
But even closing the boyfriend loophole in the Violence Against Women Act has been met with resistance by the NRA. On that specific issue, how do you move forward?
That one is a good one because there is over 30 Republicans voted for it in the House because it was in the Violence Against Women Act. So if over 30 Republicans voted for the Violence Against Women Act, which included that gun provision, that was a major breakthrough. And so that's the case that I will make to my colleagues about both the provision for closing the boyfriend loophole, which I just described, and also for the stalking provision that's in there if you're convicted of misdemeanor stalking. We had Republican witnesses when Senator Grassley chaired the Judiciary Committee. No, maybe Senator Leahy was, and Grassley was the ranking. We had a hearing on this, and several of the Republican witnesses said we should close the boyfriend loophole, including a conservative sheriff from Wisconsin. So I have a lot of evidence, and you're right about the NRA, and you're right that they've scored it, but the thing I got on my side is that over 30 Republicans voted for it in the House. So I think we can get it done.
U.S. Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa is getting flack now over the Violence Against Women's Act because she's trying to push her own version of the bill.
Mm-hmm. I'm well aware.
What pressure is she feeling And what should Iowans do if they want her to change their mind?
Well, I think they got to call her office. And I think I've described this pretty well, how serious this is. And I think that you will find cases in Iowa and across the country. Some states that have done this have had good results. But this is about the states that haven't, and so it would be the federal law that would govern in those states. I always think about a case not too far from Iowa, from Lake City, Minnesota, where a police officer went to a scene of a young man who had just, I think, gotten out of the military. Can't quite remember that piece of it. But the girlfriend called, she's very, very young, on the phone saying he was abusing her. Cop goes to the door, has a bulletproof vest on, the guy shoots him in the head. I was at that funeral, and going down the aisle was his widow and the 3 little kids. The last time they had been in that church was for the nativity play, with their dad in the pews and the kids in the play. And the mom was holding the little girl in a blue dress covered in stars. Domestic violence shooting don't just affect one person, they affect everyone. And that would be the case that I would make to Senator Ernst. This bill, again, passed the House with 30-some Republican votes, containing both some tribal provisions that are in there that are important, as well as this closing the boyfriend loophole. And for some of my colleagues that have said to me, oh, why would you have guns in the Violence Against Women Act? This is the ultimate form of violence against women. So that's what your constituents could say to her.
Do you think an agreement has any chance of passage this year on Violence Against Women?
Yes, I do. And I think it should be this bill because there's already an agreement on it. And this is not that controversial. And if they won't even do this, and this is what Iowans will find out, if they won't even do this, how are they going to do universal background checks?
Describe for us what kind of people you would populate your cabinet with, and the team of advisors.
Well, first of all, I would pick people that are going to have the backs of the people of this country, that will be experienced and know what they are doing. I think that a cabinet should reflect the people of this country in terms of women, in terms of diversity. I think that will be very important to me as well. And I will listen to people and get advice. I've done that my whole life. That's how I was able to pass over 100 bills. And you just have to have very qualified people. I'm not putting out lists on cabinet members or judges or anything else like that. I think that really politicizes it. But I think you want to put people in place that you can rely on, but you also want to have people that have their own expertise and have their own minds of their own and are willing to tell you both good news and bad news, because you don't want to just have yes people. And you think about what has happened with President Trump when he had someone as experienced as General Mattis, who finally resigned because he couldn't stomach it anymore. He lost that expertise, and our troops lost that expertise. And so my hope would be you would have a group that you trust, yes, but also that aren't sycophants, that are people that are willing to stand up to you and tell you when they don't agree. Otherwise, you're not going to be a good leader.
Is there an issue that
No one's ever asked me that before. So it was good.
an issue you can cite where you had one position and then after some more thought and research and maybe listening to the other side that you've changed your mind?
Mm-hmm. Well, I had one major thing that I wish I would have done differently that I guess you could say changed my mind, but it was on when we had the vote on the Affordable Care Act, which I feel very strongly was a good bill. And the day it passed, I said that it was a beginning and not an end. I would never change my vote on the Affordable Care Act, is not what I'm saying. But when I look back at it, I always thought, well, when I said that, we could do the pharmaceutical stuff later. We weren't able to get the votes for it. And when you look at how close that vote was, there are many days where I've thought, well, what if I'd held back my vote? Or it wouldn't probably be me alone. A few of us had. To push the pharmaceutical issue. But it had been a negotiation that at the time felt out of our control. But it would have been the one point of leverage to try to get things done when it comes to bringing in less expensive drugs from other countries, or most significantly, lifting the ban on negotiation with Medicare. And those are two bills I lead now. I believe I will be able to get them done as president, but it was something that at the time I'm not even sure I had thought through that I could have gotten that done at that moment, but maybe a group of us could. And so that's something when I look back at, because I keep trying to think, how can you take this on? The American people it's their number one healthcare issue, and nothing has happened. And I know why, because the pharmaceutical companies have 2 lobbyists for every member of Congress, and everyone's afraid. But this is not good for our healthcare system or competition, that we haven't done anything on it.
We're getting close to time. Any other questions around the table?
As you know, there have been recent dropouts in the race, including Senator Harris.
I've never heard them called dropouts. Yes,
Spreadsheets.
I know.
on
Like
it.
it's very direct. Yeah.
And after she left the race, people have said that the rules for the debate stage are unfair and they're not bringing up the most diverse candidates in all sorts of ways. How do you feel at this stage of the race those rules have helped or hurt the Democratic Party, and who is running for president still?
Well, first of all, as I said, when Kamala dropped out, we're friends, and I was very sad about it. That was my reaction the moment I heard it. We spent the night before Thanksgiving together with our families here in Iowa, and I wish she was still in the race. Corey is still in the race and made very clear today that he's going to be staying into the Iowa caucuses, and I think that's a good thing. So we will have diversity in terms of our candidates, in addition to some other candidates who are running. And I think that that's very important to our party, that we continue to have diversity. I don't know what I would do if I had control over the debate rules. It's very complicated. You know, every time you think, well, maybe this would be better, it's hard to say. But I think for me, I just focus on what I'm doing right now. And what I'm doing right now is building a very strong campaign. And we have defied expectations every step of the way, including from the very beginning when no one thought I would actually announce in the middle of that blizzard, and I did. And since then, we have been adding people in the early states. We have people in all 4 early states. We have been doubling our offices in Iowa. We just hired a number of good people, like Norm, who's the master caucus organizer, whose last name I can't pronounce right now. And we have also been able to run ads and have gotten more money in after my debates. And that's going to continue. I believe that there are several people running that are billionaires, and I don't like outside money in politics. I think they both are admirable leaders, but this doesn't feel fair when you're the one that is, having to compete with them, and they run ads. Like I was in New York City, and I think I saw 8 of their ads in a 1-hour network segment. But that gets to Iowa and South Carolina and Nevada and New Hampshire. That's why we have the early states. And I think the burden is going to be on these 4 states more than ever to make a good decision and to look at who is the right person to really lead this ticket. And my argument is that I am someone that brings people with me and doesn't shut them out. And if people are tired of the extremes and the noise and the nonsense in our politics, that they have a home with me. And I have consistently been able to win in rural and suburban and urban areas and do it in a way that I would say is winning big. And that's what we need to do across this country instead of shutting people out. And those victories in Louisiana and Kentucky and Virginia bolster my case. As does the fact that I have been the one from the beginning saying there's no monopoly on good ideas, and that it's not just my way or the highway when it comes to some of my colleagues, and that these ideas on kicking people off their current insurance, 149 million people in 4 years is not a good idea. But bringing healthcare costs down and moving toward universal healthcare is. That connecting our openings for jobs in our economy with our education system and making it easier for people to afford to go to school, but making sure we're saying, hey, these 1 and 2 year degrees, there's a lot of jobs out there that require those degrees. That's a smart way to go. And I am very glad that these debates, when you bring up the debates, have allowed for us to discuss those issues, and that is the reason, probably the only reason, that we're starting to see where people are right now when it comes to those issues. And I believe I'm a leader who has a bold plan and a 100-day plan and ideas that are consistent with where the people are in our country. And it is the way we're going to get consensus and that we're going to be able to take back the heart of our country.
Thank you, Senator. Everyone, please keep coming back to DesMoinesRegister.com to read all about our political coverage.
Can I give my website too? I'm kidding.
And all the political coverage in this caucus season. Thank you.